Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to New Books in Philosophy, a podcast channel with the New Books Network. I'm Carrie Fingdor, professor of philosophy at the University of Iowa. I'm co-host of the channel, along with Robert Talisse, Sarah Tyson, and Malcolm Keating. Together, we bring you conversations with philosophers about their new books in a wide range of areas of contemporary philosophical inquiry. Today's interview is with Ryan Nefdt, professor of philosophy at the University of Cape Town. His new book, The Philosophy of Theoretical Linguistics, is just out from Cambridge University Press. Between the study of specific languages and the philosophy of language lies what Nefdt calls a Goldilocks zone of theoretical issues related to language. In his new book, Nefdt introduces and explores the elements in this zone, which include different theories of syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, and differing views of how language evolved, which languages are possible, and what defines language. Nefdt shows where dominant linguistic theories, such as Chomskyan syntactic theory and truth-conditional semantics, fit in a generalized framework where a key theoretical dimension is the role of social context. Let's turn to the interview. Hello, Ryan Nefdt. Welcome to New Books in Philosophy.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I'm really looking forward to talking about your new book, Philosophy of Theoretical Linguistics. Tell us a bit about yourself first. How you got to write about this topic, how you became a philosopher. However much you want to tell us.
Sure, I'll try to be brief, even though the route is quite circuitous. So I'm born and bred South African. I grew up during apartheid and spent my teenage years in the post-apartheid South Africa. And I grew up in a place that wasn't really, I didn't see much representation, especially academic representation in my race group or as a scholar, eventual scholar of color. So finding philosophy was actually not a direct path. Maybe it's not a direct path for anybody, but especially for me, I think my grandmother was always disappointed that I didn't become an electrician. So I hope that I haven't done too badly in her eyes now. But so I think I started with languages, actually. Not really philosophy directly. I was very interested in learning languages. South Africa has, at that time, had 11 official languages. Now with South African Sign Language, it's 12 and many other languages in the vicinity. And I grew up in this multilingual society. And so decoding what people were saying and interacting with them in different kinds of registers and code switching and all of these things were just a normal part of my life, but it was something that I often reflected on even as a young child. And so when I went to university, my first port of call was to sort of study languages, and I studied about 8 languages and really enjoyed that journey. And then I thought, well, when I'm studying these languages, I'm not really this is a very practical exercise and it's very interesting. And I'm noticing some commonalities between different language families, even Nguni language families in Southern Africa and Indo-European languages and things like that. So I needed an outlet to sort of look for the connections, and that brought me to philosophy. Perhaps it should have more directly brought me to linguistics, but I was happy to find linguistics later in life after philosophy, I think. I think that worked out well for me. Mm-hmm. And so I explored philosophy of language, the classical texts from Kripke and Donnellan and Davidson, right, and Millikan and all of these great scholars talking about language and how it evolved and how we use it, communication and everything. And so then at some point, I felt like I was missing the sort of Goldilocks in the picture. I had studied the practical languages and I had studied the philosophy of language, but there the notion of language is much more broad and abstract. It's not about individual languages, and studying individual languages didn't give me that theoretical lens. And I eventually found theoretical linguistics and fell in love at that point. And once I had that missing link in my education, I think things kind of just vistas opened up for me, and it led me to just feeling as though there was just so much unexplored territory in the philosophy of linguistics, from the philosophy of science perspective, from the philosophy of language, from a cognitive scientific lens. It was just endlessly fascinating, and I'm still sitting here today, super fascinated, having written a few books on it, and still feeling like there's just much, much more to say. So that's the route from an unlikely sort of beginning, a missed opportunity to become an electrician, and eventually finding myself as a philosopher. Sometimes I'm considered a philosopher. Sometimes people think I'm some sort of theoretical linguist and, cognitive scientist. It varies, and I think those boundaries shouldn't be as strict as some people take them to be. But that's how I ended up where I am, at least intellectually.
Cool. So I think, probably most of our listeners, although certainly not all, would be philosophers. What is this Goldilocks zone? What is philosophy of, what is theoretical linguistics such that it is not philosophy of language? I mean, describe in broad terms, before we get into details, what the scope of philosophy of theoretical linguistics is.
Right. So, again, this is surprisingly, it's still a work in progress. I think when I started writing the book, I thought that the first chapter would just be so easy to express. Well, let's just start out, say what theoretical linguistics is. And I was surprised at how much of a philosophical task that was. And in the book, I contrasted the concept of theoretical linguistics with experimental linguistics, but that didn't quite work because there are lots of experiments, depending on your definition of experiments. Maybe introspective judgments don't count for you, but for many people they do. And that's part of theoretical linguistics. They are applied topics. It's not a clear distinction. And so then I started looking at other places. Well, what about theoretical linguistics and theoretical physics and applied physics? Is the clue to using these modifiers and contrasting them there. Eventually, I settled upon a working definition for the book in terms of a series of interconnected questions. So to be a theoretical linguist, not necessary and sufficient conditions or anything, but the working definition, at least, you have to be interested in the relationship between language with a big L, I called it, so sort of like this general concept of language, and languages as they are practiced, spoken, acquired in individual linguistic communities. How humans acquire language, that's an important aspect of theoretical linguistics. One that at least is fought over is how much a theoretical linguist owes us in terms of an explanation of communication. I put that as quite central in my book. And then, of course, how language evolved. And I think to answer your question, that's where philosophy of language departs to a certain extent. Because I don't think you have to be interested, firstly, in the structure of individual languages too much. In philosophy, at times there were these epochs, like maybe ordinary language philosophy, that looked like it was concerned with the individual structure of language, but sadly it was more the individual structure of English to a large extent, and wasn't really a cross-linguistic purview. And then communication, that's where the philosophers of language, I think, have done quite well. But the sort of set of these questions combined, I think, differentiates theoretical linguistics from philosophy of language and other related pursuits.
Okay, so that's helpful. So you mentioned, language with a big L and languages, and of course, I'm sure you're aware of David Lewis's famous article, "Language and Languages," right? So, what is your take on that? I mean, given your just basically how is what you just said about language of the big L and languages? How does that map onto Lewis's language and languages?
That's interesting. So my interpretation of Lewis was always that it's sort of this abstract object of a language that can be sort of mathematically characterized. You could think of it as a model, and then you sort of look for what that models, and that help in what you end up with is some sort of like, I think he talks about trust and truthfulness in a community. So these conventions and whether this mathematical model maps onto these conventions in linguistic communities. The articles all are the sort of Hegelian, the synthesis and antithesis and things like that. And so I actually think there are parts of the book where I mentioned Lewis, and in other works I've done that. And I think it's a really guiding principle for me, because there's a sense in which I'm not interested in the abstract object of language in and of itself. I don't know what that is. I'm interested in whatever formal tools or scientific tools we can use to understand this phenomenon, this global phenomenon, potentially uniquely human phenomenon of language, which is the practices that we'll find and the conventions in linguistic communities. And that's going to involve some sort of mental vocabulary. We are interested in what's inside people's heads, but we're also interested in the sort of conventions and how we precisely model that. And that is where sort of formal grammars come in.
Okay, good. So you mentioned, well, let me go on to you mentioned structure, the structure of individual languages, and not necessarily English as because so many philosophers of language are, Anglophone, at least their primary language. So you should say something about this idea of structure. I mean, syntax is, one of the, if not the, depending on the person, necessary and perhaps even sufficient, conditions for what makes some practice language practice. So how do you approach the topic of syntax? What is syntax? What role does it play within theoretical linguistics? And I know you talk about a number of different types of views of what syntax is. So what is your, tell us a bit about your discussion of the issue of syntax itself.
So I think this sort of demarcates me as a strange philosopher as well, because philosophers, as I mentioned in the book and elsewhere, there's this intimate relationship between semantics and philosophy, I think, especially philosophy of language. There's historical precedent for that relationship. There's some sort of cross-pollination over the years and the decades and things like that. But syntax, not so much. I often find myself quite isolated as a philosopher of syntax when I put that hat on. So that was a big part of the book for me to say something about that. Now, there are lots of philosophical reflections on syntax, but they usually come to us from the very well-established sort of canon of generative linguistics. Chomsky has this revolutionary sort of status in linguistics, and what he did, which I think was quite remarkable among many other things, was that he developed this formal theory of syntax, but he also constantly reflected on its philosophy and engaged with philosophers at various moments, not always happily, but he did engage. And so I think that's often where the starting point is. Like, syntax is this study of these hierarchical representations of sentences and their combination in the mind, in some sort of language faculty, this modular language faculty in the brain. What I was trying to do in the book was something completely different. Firstly, I've studied many different kinds of frameworks, so not just the generative linguistic approach to syntax, but dependency grammar. I actually have a few papers on that. I'm very interested in dependency grammar, which is quite prominent in continental Europe. It's quite prominent in natural language processing as a representation of syntactic structure, which is interesting given the dominance of sort of the phrase structure, hierarchical notion in linguistics for many years. So I'm quite a big fan of at least the theory of dependency grammar, lexical functional grammar, head-driven phrase structure grammar, which is a syntax that looks at a different side. It's not proof theoretic, which is where a lot of the interesting early results in syntax came from proof theory in mathematics. Mm-hmm. This comes rather from model theory, where philosophers might be more familiar because model theory underpins Montague grammar and semantics. So for me, syntax and the way I approached it was like, syntax is a kind of explanatory strategy. Mm-hmm. You're modeling in a particular kind of way, and you're interested in finding certain kinds of structures in what you're modeling. So for instance, I highlight a few components that I think are part of every syntactic, scientific syntactic explanation. And these things are like rule boundedness, the idea that language is rule bounded, or the autonomy of syntax, the idea that syntax, and this comes from Chomsky as well, that syntax is somehow separate, either in an explanatory sense, you can talk about syntax without talking about semantics and pragmatics and phonology and things like that. And then lastly, the more controversial one was that there's something about recursive structure, something about the fact that in syntax, when you're combining different units to create sentences, you can, the sort of like the cool potentially infinity creating device there is this embedding mechanism that you can embed structure within structure and then get an explosion of strings or output or further structures. Chomsky talk about descriptive structural descriptions and things like that. So I took those three things as basic and I said, okay, let this be my guide and let me see if I can find traces of this basic explanatory strategy across diverse syntactic frameworks. And in many cases, sort of the rhetoric between these frameworks is very oppositional. Mm-hmm. So that was a fun journey, and I think it took me sort of to the edges of possibility, taking something like what's known as radical construction grammar, which is supposed to reject everything that Chomskyans hold dear, and finding this basic sort of tripartite structure within even radical construction grammar. I'm not sure many radical construction grammarians will agree with me there, but at least that was my attempted account. So syntax for me, at least the scientific project of syntax, is a kind of explanatory strategy that relies on these three core components. And then if you want to adjust that so you can add a little more gusto to your recursion component, and then you get something like minimalism, where you say languages are by definition recursive, but I don't think that's necessary. And various other kinds of, you could add gusto to your autonomy thesis to say that syntax is sort of represented in the brain separately. Many neuro-linguists have explored that possibility as well. So I hope that's clear, or at least a movement towards relation to syntax. So,
I mean, this is somewhat off topic a little bit, but there's also some people, I don't know if you mentioned this, think you do, who think of syntax as something that's even broader, that's not even just linguistic, but actually has to do with structuring actions as well.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
I do mention Terence Horgan and Tyson's work on taking this notion of syntax to action theory, and the idea of syntax. And I think it dovetails nicely with my view, because it's really this rule boundedness of syntax that they're taking. They're extricating it from the sort of linguistic units that you might get, constituents in a syntax tree, and saying, can we apply this elsewhere? Do these kinds of hierarchical structures pop up elsewhere in nature and in cognition? And the answer is yes, it does very often. And I think those connections are inchoate, but extremely interesting.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, because I think you mentioned Mark Steedman's work. He also does some of this.
So Mark is really fantastic from the point of connecting many of these sort of formal notions to like viable cognitive cognitive grounding. He really takes this notion, and it connects nicely with semantics as well, because in this categorical grammar idea that seems to underpin even the sort of phrase structure that Chomsky used to sort of translate it. I think that, if I must say, I think not talking more about Steedman's view and categorical grammar and things like that was probably an omission in the book. I think I should have done more. If I could rewrite it now, I would add some more on that topic specifically. I think it's a nice point of connection between many of these theories. And it certainly, I think, adheres to my my three components.
Okay, so you just mentioned semantics, which is, again, between syntax and semantics, you kind of cover a lot of what philosophers of language are usually interested in, along with a bit of, pragmatics, conversational, Gricean sorts of things. So semantics, I mean, the standard view that I grew up with, that you grew up with, is truth conditional, semantics, where, the meaning of a sentence is, given by a proposition, and propositions are these language independent, abstract entities that, encapsulate meaning. I mean, that's my, my philosophy of language background. So how do you depart from that standard kind of truth conditional, Tarskian even view of semantics? How does if you're giving a sort of a metasyntactic view of what we normally think of as syntax and taking a broader perspective on that, what is your sort of equivalent broader view on the issue of the semantics of languages?
Right. So semantics is a beautiful theoretical beast. Syntax, in some ways, I feel like syntax plays nicer than semantics does, because semantics just, especially the way syntax is developed, because semantics implicates the world. And I think that's what you're referring to, how we grew up, is sort of like some sort of picture theory of meaning. Something is happening there where our words, our sentences are being constructed in such a way from their syntactic sort of skeleton and being populated with these objects, whether it's mathematical objects or not, that refer to things in the world that have semantic value that maps onto eventually some sort of percolation in the tree to a sentence that has truth conditions. Well, and I think that idea is beautiful in many ways. It's got a nice answer to the syntax-semantics interface. This idea of compositionality. You give me a set of rules, you give me a syntactic tree, and I'll map each item on that tree. I'll take each rule and I'll give you a semantic rule that corresponds with it. And now I've got a nice picture of the building blocks of language that maps onto how this language sort of describes the world in some interesting way and leads to truth and other things like that. So that's a beautiful picture. It's very limited. Mm-hmm. And I think over the past maybe decade or two, with massive amounts of alternative theories, whether they're extensions or completely opposing views, dynamic semantics comes to mind, that just they bring out the limitations of this static concept of this propositional calculus semantics. And I think the way that I try to frame that issue is all about context. Different theories are going to approach context in different ways. So the static truth conditional theories approach context in a kind of way that context is this, I wouldn't say epiphenomenal, but it's sort of like parametric settings. There's a minimal basis. I think Capellan and Lepore called this semantic minimalism. Things have their actual meanings. They sort of like uncontextualized meanings, and then context just adds some sort of parameters. Maybe indexicals require us to do a little bit more, and but language has this minimalist semantic representation, and I think that's a very hard position to maintain. I think context is doing way more, and I'm not sure it's doing as much as sort of radical contextualists think it's doing. But I think your different approaches to semantics have to take into consideration the different roles that context plays in interpretation and in meaning. And so that's how I sort of set up this continuum of responses to context in the semantics chapter, where I'm saying you've got the sort of traditional Montegovian formal semantics that is almost like syntax. It's very structural. And then as you go further with its dynamic semantics or more context committing views, you see this continuum. So you end up with distributional semantics that says, well, maybe we can just model meaning as some sort of matrix with collocational information, and the closer one word is in context to another one actually gives you some metric for semantic similarity or things like that. And that obviously has led to a lot of insights in terms of deep learning and natural language processing, because that forms a major part of how those systems work. But yeah, for me, the traditional picture is maybe it's a good start. I don't know. I didn't start with it. I actually learned semantics when I was in Amsterdam, and what's funny is that I started with the dynamic semantics because Amsterdam is sort of the home of that kind of approach to language. So I didn't learn static. I didn't learn Hyman Kratzer first. I actually learned sort of like the dynamic picture first, and then I sort of had to retrace and infer what the foil was, or the picture that's coming from. Right. So maybe that affected my biases, and I'm primed in certain ways, given that my education was the other way around.
Okay. So where would you put on this continuum of context involvement? I mean, on the one hand, you have very, very, I suppose at the one end you just have Tarski. Where would you have people like, doing indexicals or relevant semantics, or even where would you put the major figures that do involve context, even within the propositional picture?
Well, I think the standard, and I don't really go into this too much, but the standard home for many of, I think even the default consensus, if we can use that term in philosophy, position is what's called moderate contextualism. So there is some sort of minimalist scaffolding that comes to us either from syntax or the world or some combination thereof, and then context moderates that picture, and that can have radical effects sometimes. And this is where linguistic theory comes into it nicely. It's not just done on the sort of abstract chalkboard, but you can look at concepts like grammaticalization and see maybe a meaning, a phrase actually had more of a literal meaning where you could deduce it from its component parts and the syntax. And then when it was used metaphorically, the metaphor took over. And now we can't even retrace what the original was. And I think those kinds of, that's the nice part, again, to come back to something you asked me right at the beginning. That's the nice part of philosophy of theoretical linguistics and linguistics in general, because I think it can add that nuance to philosophy of language and to semantics and the way that's been practiced over the years as well, by talking about these mechanisms that linguists have noticed in sort of diachronic linguistics, how language changes over time.
So, okay, yeah. I was just thinking about change, right? How meaning shifts, right?
Right.
Can you say something about that? I mean, are there different views? Well, there must be different views of change of meaning.
Certainly. I mean, I think this is why this space is so interesting, and why philosophers and linguists have been good friends for many years, even despite sometimes not picking up the phone to one another. I think because we talk about change in different ways, and I think it would be unfair to say philosophers aren't interested in this kind of diachronic picture because, I mean, look at Kripke and causal chains and the initial baptisms. Even though it's a very abstract theory, it kind of is suggesting that history plays a role in reference fixing. Gareth Evans' sort of Madagascar examples and things like that. So there is an idea of change there, but it's certainly not one that's responsive or bottom up in the way that linguists are interested in. Sort of like looking at actual historical texts and trying to trace the morphological roots of particular kinds of phrases and words and idioms and things like that. So I think philosophers sometimes like to use those things as anecdotal examples and their top-down theories. Yeah. But the book, at least the way I tried to write it, was to talk in the middle ground where a lot of what I'm discussing is sort of bottom up. And in the pragmatics chapter, especially, that's where I think that was maybe the hardest chapter to write for me, because I started with like Grice and Stalnecker and Lewis, and then I went to sort of like Sperber and Wilson and spoke about relevance theory. And then I tried to connect those sort of like the fossils of the thought of how pragmatics works and how you demarcate pragmatics from semantics. I try to connect it to some contemporary, like practical, in a sense, views on pragmatics, or like game theoretic pragmatics and optimality theoretic pragmatics. How do those systems, how do those linguists working in those areas either assume or interact with these older philosophical ideas about what pragmatics is? And I suggested like the game theory and the Bayesian approaches are tracking something sort of social conventional about pragmatics, which starts with Stalnecker, but really gains life a little bit afterwards when people try to extend the common ground to some features of society and like real, like populated with real humans who have personalities and have, you know, identities beyond the sort of abstract plotting of a philosopher's logical system.
Okay. My next question was going to be probing the pragmatics semantics divide. Pragmatics typically being the sort of where anything that's not syntax or semantics gets kind of thrown into the pragmatics hopper. So what sorts of theories of pragmatics do you deal with in the book? You know, again, along the same sort of, Goldilocks level of, meta pragmatics. What's going on in that area of theoretical linguistics?
Yeah, so much, honestly. I think there's just been immense work and promising work, because I think they are philosophers, logicians, cognitive scientists, and linguists all working in this space and learning from each other and adapting each other's theories. And I think that's what makes it exciting, but also makes it frightening, because it's moving so fast. And when you write a book, you try to hold things still for a moment. I have colleagues, especially in the supersemantics, this new idea of supersemantics, which maybe we'll talk about in a bit, but they just can't imagine writing a book because things are moving so fast for them. So part of the goal of that chapter was just to slow things down and like try to catch it, but you feel like you're dealing with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle the second you shoot a photon at it, or the second you start typing a word, and things have changed. So I try to, it's very hard to differentiate. So especially along the lines that I spoke about semantics, where I was saying context is the central concept to differentiate different frameworks and approaches. If context is that important and we're dealing with context and interpretation and meaning, then we're pretty much talking about semantics, about pragmatics as well. And Louise McNally pointed this out to me, and she's written about it as well, that it's kind of strange that two distinct disciplines emerged talking about what seems to be the same phenomena. And so that was a challenge for the chapter, but of course nomenclature does have some effect on us. So often what we call pragmatics is useful to at least as a starting point to see what's going on. So in terms of the theories I looked at indexical, cognitivist, and what I called social inferential theories. That was the sort of like the things that try to separate semantics from pragmatics. Maybe semantics, according to Montague or something, is just pragmatics is just a version of semantics, just adding more parameters and adding something like indexicality to those parameters where you wouldn't do that in your semantics or something. Or maybe there's something deeply sort of like cognitivist going on there, like Sperber and Wilson's view. They were taking Grice and taking especially the maxim of relevance as a cognitive principle that we use to interpret others according to sort of like optimality as opposed to truth and things like that. And then the social inferential, like I said, at least stemming to a certain extent in my analysis from Stalnick-Herian picture to involving sociolinguistic concepts. Mm-hmm. So that was the overarching framework to try to like demarcate semantics and pragmatics. Each one of those options have different ways of saying this is semantics, this is pragmatics. Maybe for the cognitivists, like the relevance theorists, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics are literally different parts of your brain or different parts of your mind that are operational there. And maybe the social inferentialists would add that social dimension involving conventions of speakers in a way that they might not say semantics requires, something like that. And then I try to see, okay, what are these linguistic theories like optimality theory in pragmatics and game theory and Bayesian pragmatics really doing, and how much of this previous structure are they assuming? I got some sort of connection between optimality theory and cognitivist models, because they, I think optimality constraint satisfaction is key, and that translates nicely to sort of relevance theory. Game theory and Bayesianism interacts nicely with the social inferential view of pragmatics, because it's a slightly a step back, but it's still modeling dynamics and interactions, and you can sort of add more detail of the individuals in the interaction based on your model, which I think speaks more towards this social inferential notion of the divide. But of course, you can do optimality theory, game theory, Bayesianism on semantics too. So I think the take home is that these are artificial labels we've put on a very messy, interrelated space of phenomena that we call semantic pragmatic. And any separation we're going to do there or attempt is going to be slightly arbitrary at times. Doesn't mean that as philosophers we don't need to try to see if there are any of nature's joints to carve out there, to paraphrase Lewis.
Okay. So maybe we should have discussed this earlier, but so language in general, or at least when we talk about language, we think of, well, there's a big debate whether language is unique to humans or if just human languages are just one form of language, and the term language can be used for other sorts of communication systems. And partly that's a verbal dispute, how you want to use the word language, but I'm not really interested so much in the verbal aspect, but more what makes a human language a language, and how human languages do differ from other communication systems, whether you want to call them languages or not.
Right. Yeah, so that's the big topic I try to address in the second chapter, sort of like I suggest that maybe theoretical linguistics is really asking this question of what is a possible human language or natural language. And everything we do is in service of that overarching goal. And my chosen sort of framing for that is a little light modal metaphysics. So I suggest that why don't we just frame this in a way that suggests, okay, let's take instead of possible worlds, we have these possible languages. These are the states in our space. And we have accessibility relations determined by linguistic theory. So now we can start axiomatizing the system. And the axioms that I use to answer that question that you just posed is acquirability, that I take from the generative camp, and usability, which I take from everybody else. And usability as a primary mode of communication specifically. So if you put these together, I call it the naturalness axiom in that chapter. I think you get a demarcation of the possible and the impossible, or the possible and the less possible, according to this metric. So, for instance, a pidgin language is something that is usable as a primary mode of communication. As we know, many communities around the world, especially displaced people, were forced to invent pidgins because there was no common sort of lingua franca. And but it wasn't acquirable. The second a pidgin grammaticalizes and becomes acquirable, at least the standard story goes, you get a Creole language, which is something different. So so the pidgin was at the periphery because it didn't satisfy one element of that. Now, on the extreme levels of the impossible languages, you get things like maybe the language of piano arithmetic or something, or first order propositional logic. It's not usable as a primary mode of communication between humans and, as far as we know, anybody else. And it's certainly not acquirable because you don't generally find communities of first order language, first order logic speakers, although I have come close in my academic travels. They were very hard to understand. And you've now got this metric, this framing that you start off with the modal metaphysics, pick your system, maybe S5, because it's nice and clean. And then you plug in your linguistic theory to get your axioms. And doing that process gives you the kind of constraints of what you might consider possible versus impossible. So, for instance, generativists like Andrea Moro that I speak about in the chapter, they take sort of recursive hierarchical structure to be the sine qua non of natural language. So Their theory is really going to be based around that. And if a theory has that kind of structure, it's really not that important whether that, it's sort of like an acceptation that we use it for communication or something like that. But the core of what makes a language is almost syntactic and recursive, whereas my view is a little bit more eclectic. I think you have to have some element of sort of primary communication, tool for primary communication in that structure. And then you're going to get other kinds of constraints. So some things might, to a being different from ourselves that can handle something like context-sensitive linguistic structure, maybe they could have acquired that and used it as a primary mode of communication, a grammar that has those like very complex rules, but we can't. So that also makes that through linguistic theory, we also start thinking that language is impossible for us, or less possible at least.
Right. Okay. So do you buy the sort of, you mentioned the evolution of language earlier, and in fact, you get to it later in the book. How do you address that issue? I mean, that's a big issue today is, how did language evolve, by which people usually mean how did the features that we associate with, theorize about, for human language, how did those evolve? Typically on the assumption that they are unique to humans.
Right.
Yeah.
The language evolution, I think sometimes when I'm getting into language evolution literature and trying to write about it, I think the French Academy way back in the day went so far off by just banning all talk of it, because I think it's just, it's complicated. It's complicated in ways that, I think of common phrases, but there's no end to the plausible storytelling. I mean, that's maybe evolution in general, but language evolution seems to particularly have the hallmarks of this messy basic space. So that's a tricky one. But I suppose when I was thinking about it, you get this. Linguists have been very interested, especially of the Chomskyan in the Chomskyan framework, in this question, and they often start on certain kinds of principles. So they take language to be something like syntax. Actually, they take it even to be more narrow than that, something like merge, this operation that takes two syntactic objects and creates one labeled object like a set. So if you start there, then you're looking for symbolic sort of representations in early human populations, and you end up pointing at the timeline somewhere about 100,000 years ago. And now you've got very little space to play in as an evolutionary theorist, because that doesn't give you most of the resources of evolutionary time. So now you have to say a lot of unique claims, and that's where I think this human uniqueness pops out, because you can't really sort of avail yourself of a tapestry view where you're saying, well, we took a little bit from here and we took a little bit from here, and put it all together over millions of years and things like that, because you've got this much shorter timeline. You've got a more circumscribed object as well, this merge postulate syntax, narrow syntax, and then you're going to get, I think, what the sort of logical conclusion is, that you get some sort of saltationist view. So there must have been a macro mutation and rewired the human brain, and all of a sudden we sort of took over the world. I don't think that story is wrong. I just think if you play with the assumptions, you get different possibilities, and one assumption is that timeline. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, I just wanted to clarify. So the idea is that symbolic representation, in terms of, I don't know, conventional symbols first appeared 100,000 years ago. Is that the idea?
So the literature that's often cited is literature that dates this sort of symbol representation to cave paintings, some of which actually in South Africa. So so that's where you sort of start, and you assume, well, if that kind of representation was there, then those were the sort of initial conditions for language and syntax specifically. So that's usually where those come from. But then so some people like Everett, for instance, thinks, well, we've got this situation where it seems like much earlier hominids needed to cross an ocean. And now, how do we explain that if they didn't have any mode of communication between themselves to create sort of apparatus for doing such a thing? And then you get a different set of evidence or a different set of considerations for why maybe the window is much longer than 100,000 years, a couple of million. Still not like hectic evolutionary time that we might want for other kinds of evolved elements in nature, but a little bit longer than 100,000 years, where you're sort of forced into this saltationist view. Yeah, you could at least use some sort of gradualist notion of syntax and semantics emerging over time, possibly starting from a point of communication. And then you get people like Derek Bickerton who try to sort of have it both ways and suggest there's a little bit of both scenarios happening. And I think this was a fun exercise to see what happens when you mix and match, and when you take on, you create sort of consistent models of different starting points. And what this led me to was what I call sort of a systems biolinguistics, the maximalist approach. Got lots of little attempts at cute terms in the book. And the maximalist approach says, well, we're not interested in reducing the complexity. We're not interested in finding that one sort of core thing. We're actually looking a little bit more broadly. And I think this approach is made possible by the leaps and bounds of complexity science in the past, 30, 40 years, where we don't have to make the kinds of neutralizing idealizations that Chomsky felt that he needed to make at a certain point. And I think he was right to make it that point, because we can actually use different kinds of analyses to talk about a more complicated object. And I think language really just does tick all the boxes in terms of complex system, sort of numerosity, feedback, adaptive behavior, nested structure. These are all the kinds of things we see in other complex systems. And the tools we use there, if we're talking about the evolution, tends to be much broader evolutionary time and sort of network analysis and, systems biology. And that's in that part of the book, I was just exploring those options for how to talk about the evolution of language.
Okay. I'm tempted to go a bit more into that, but I also want to make sure that we have time to talk a little bit about machine languages or, computationalism and computer languages and large language processing and that whole artificial intelligence / language aspect. So one of the things that you raise the idea is the idea that we have these computational models of language, and they add something about prediction, the ability to predict linguistic phenomena. So could you say a bit about the importance to you of adding this predictive element to our theorizing about language?
Sure. Yeah. So I think prediction is sometimes and there's a complicated history, one that I just shared in the book. It's kind of the stepsister to explanation in science. You want to explain things, but explanation is cheap to a certain extent. I'm being unnecessarily controversial, but you get explanatory theories in theology and a priori metaphysics and all of those kinds of things. And some of them are very convincing and some of them are very consistent, internally consistent. But what you don't get is this element of predictive success, this ability to use that model to predict the next moment in time, to predict the future, which you do get with science. And I think that's why many people in sort of the wake of logical positivism try to put prediction back into the picture, because there, of course, it was quite prominent for many of the reasons that I'm suggesting. But it lost its way, and contemporary philosophers of science really think that these two things are the same, the different sides of the same coin, prediction and explanation. We've got a good explanation that should generate predictions. And I think the computational picture in theoretical linguistics really brings that concept back to the fore, which isn't to say that linguistic explanation of other varieties in theoretical linguistics didn't have an element of prediction attached to it. If I say this is what my syntactic relationship is C command, and that's setting up these kinds of binding constraints, then I should see something being ungrammatical if it violates that. And I think that element of prediction was there and has always been. But really with computational models, prediction is coming up first and foremost. And I think that's to the benefit of the science.
Okay. I don't recall anyway a particular chapter on the relation between language and thought. So the idea of cognition comes up at various times, kind of throughout the book, obviously. But how does your view of, theoretical linguistics as this kind of medium, between the actual studies of languages and then the more abstract philosophical view, there still remains a question about, well, what does that tell us? What's the Goldilocks in terms of the relation between language and thought?
Mm-hmm. That's a big question. And it connects to, I think it's maybe the deepest question one can ask, because it connects to everything else we've been talking about. It connects to computational linguistics and the idea that even generative grammar of the 1950s was, to a large extent, an advocate and instantiation and best example at the time of the computational theory of mind at work. And that was a theory about how cognition works, and it works on these forms and these transformations of these forms. And then you have something like Fodor's language of thought, or representationalist theory of mind, which gives the components more content. And I think so these language and thought have always been connected, even in the way that they are modeled. So as I mentioned, the generative picture comes from there. And then I think vistas are opened up even with the sort of advent of deep learning and computational approaches, because I think more so than before, the success of autoregression, this idea that predicting the next token in a sequence can produce something like natural language and all of its naturalness when you're conversing with a chatbot, whether it's GPT or Gemini or something. And the fact that this is producible, I don't think anyone thought it would be, just based on this autoregression task, just predicting the next token, made many people think, well, how does human thought work? Maybe we're predicting the next token as well, based on some sort of like distributional analysis of the sentences and the words we've heard before. To what extent are we doing that? And predictive processing is a big topic in neurolinguistics. So I think it goes in that direction too, but it seems like wherever you go, they come together to a certain extent. I mean, Davidson really thought that you couldn't extricate language from thought. I think you have to be able to do it. Again, this isn't really something I talk about in the book, but because we're having a nice chat, I'll go beyond those bounds. I think one thing that forces you to go beyond this connection is the fact that I do think non-human animals are capable of thought. And I don't think, and here's the other side of the coin, this is the new one, I don't think that large language models are capable of thought. But large language models have language, they don't have thought, and non-human animals have thought, but they don't have language. So I think in humans that you get this beautiful marriage, but they are separable conceptually and scientifically as well.
Okay, well that's those are all very controversial sort of. I mean, there's it's very interesting to compare our views of non-human systems. When they're large language models, artificial systems versus non-human biological systems. Yeah. So last question before we sort of wrap up. Do you think there's something in biological versus artificial, systems that have language or language-looking sorts of communication systems? Do you think there's something in biology that makes a difference there?
Yes, but I'm going to qualify that to say that I think there's something in systems biology that does that, and that's not necessarily impossible to replicate in artificial systems. And what I mean by that is that I don't think it's individual biology that's creating the space for language. I think it's when we interact at that systems level, when we're all nodes in a network that needs to communicate in particular kinds of ways. I think language emerges in that space. So the question then becomes, will artificial models be able to be incorporated into that sort of linguistic community? And Matt Mendelken and Tal Linson recently wrote a paper inspired by some of the sort of causal externalist philosophy of language to say, yes, there is a way to sort of plug large language models into the linguistic community. And insofar as you do that, they're going to get reference to the external world and actually have meaning in this important way. I think that I'm not sure if I agree with their answer, but I do think that's the question. And I think it's that systems level, community level, all of our individual biologies interacting at the systems level that creates the conditions for something as complex and beautiful as natural language to emerge. And insofar as we could do that, incorporate these artificial systems into that, maybe we have already, maybe we will never be able to, but that would be the point at which we might see something genuinely linguistic popping up there.
Interesting. Okay, well, we're out of time, but I'd like to end with a question about what is on the immediate horizon for you. Is there some aspect of the book that you are, kind of delving into deeper, or have you turned to something else? What's on your plate at the moment?
So I think one problem with the book that seemed a little bit unavoidable for me was that it's just, I tried to say too much, but I didn't have a lot of space to say it, and I didn't have a lot of space to say it because I didn't want to write a tome on pain of no one reading it. And so I think there are lots of aspects that I can expand more. So, for instance, I'm actually, in light of what we're talking about now, myself and a collaborator at Bristol University, we're working on this question of context in large language models, whether large language models have any ability to access the sort of non-linguistic worldly context in their mechanisms, for one thing, and then their interactions. So maybe fine-tuning or reinforced learning with human feedback. Are we imparting context to these machines? So I think the questions that we're just talking about are questions that I'm very interested in expanding and taking all the building blocks that I tried to set up in this book, and then asking those questions about large language models, for one thing, and then some related topics as well.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess we should wrap up. I just want to thank you again for taking the time to talk with New Books in Philosophy about your new book.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Okay. Bye-bye. You've been listening to an interview with Ryan Nefdt, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cape Town. We've been talking about his new book, The Philosophy of Theoretical Linguistics, which is just out from Cambridge University Press. I'm Carrie Figdor. This is New Books in Philosophy, a podcast with the New Books Network. I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and thank you for listening.